Hello and welcome to part 2 of this Vampire Coast army roster. On this case, this is the video where we go over the units. I'll go over the units, both initial stats and then after research, XP and redline skills, so that you can better see how they evolve during the course of a campaign. So, as I've said before, they rely a little bit more on their ridiculous ranged power and focus a little bit on magic, but that's not their only strength. Let's pursue and check out their advantages and disadvantages. So, for the most part, they have good infantry, great missiles and artillery, good monstrous infantry, some decent flyers, and good single entities. Of course, you can also add that they have quite good lores of magic to their disposal. For their disadvantages, they do lack cavalry, they are somewhat slow overall, and they also depend on terrain greatly for a line of sight. That's actually why sometimes the flying units are actually good, because they don't depend on that line of sight. If you're tired of having those issues, you can try some compositions with those. So without further ado, let's check out the units, but let's start actually with how they all have some specific abilities. Number one, they all have black powder plenty. So not all of them, but the units that have missiles, they also have the black powder plenty, which is basically when the ammunition is above 80%, they have plus 30% of missile strength. So those first early shots in your battles, you gotta make them count. Don't target any moving targets or anything like that. Target those that you know that you can accurately hit, because then they'll do a lot more damage. Just a hint for you guys. In addition, if you're already in range, stop and fire, because that's how they work. Of course, most of your units are undead, and being undead, they will either crumble or disintegrate depending on the status of their leadership. The advantage of this is that you can make sure that they'll fight to the end. And while they fight to the end, you can just make sure that you position them wisely. Wherever you position them, that's where they're gonna stay until they die. So if you have them on the high ground, they benefit from those high ground bonuses. Wink, wink. Got it? Let's go into the units themselves. We're gonna start with the infantry. Zombie Pirate Deckhand Mob, or also Deckhand Mob, because it's difficult to say only Zombie Pirate all the time. So they have a lot of health, and the best way to describe them is, of course, as the unit description says, they are meat shield. In essence, these units don't have a lot of armor or melee attack or melee defense. They do have quite surprisingly high weapon strength. 29 is quite a surprising value. Many troops here have like 27, 25, 22, so it's amazing that they have more. And they also have a nice charge bonus of 10, which is surprising. Now, late game, of course, these units will get better, but it's not like they're ever gonna go away from being just a meat shield. And that's their main bonus idea, to just go through the enemy, just ensure that they cannot fire through you, and also ensure that your units or your range power can do their damage. If you prefer something more with a little bit more oomph, you have the Tithe of Skjold or something like that. These are the ROR Deckhand mobs. They have Frenzy, they have Rowdy, which means that they also have Perfect Vigor. So these guys will fight a little bit better. They have better stats overall, but don't count on them fighting to the end against and destroying multiple units. No, they're just a meat shield, just at the others, just causing a little bit more damage. Now to a unit that actually is quite underviewed. These are Deckhand mobs with pole arms. They are anti-large because they have that pole arm. They have decent melee defense, not too great stats, but they can do quite some damage against light cavalry, against large entities. They have a lot of models, and they will survive for quite some time, so don't neglect these guys. They're quite surprising. They have armor piercing and anti-large. It's a tier 1 unit that has armor piercing and anti-large. Sometimes you have one or the other, not both. So it's quite neglected. In the late game, you can also field a couple of these guys just to cover your flanks or to cover your artillery units, for instance, or missile units, and they'll do just fine against anything that it's not, of course, heavy cavalry or heavy monsters. If you prefer something ethereal, then you have the Sirens. Of course, they don't have any armor, being ethereal. They have some physical resistance to account for that, and they have decent melee defense and melee attack values. Is kind of kind of average. They have that magical attacks, and the biggest idea is that they have 32 completely full armor piercing. They have Strider and that physical resistance, as I was saying, 55%. They cause terror. Sometimes it's good to have a unit that causes terror so early in the game, so that's also something to account for. They can be used both in the front line or as flanking units because of that. So because they're kind of like faster, one of the faster units that you get, you can kind of use them as flanking units unless the enemy has, anti-large cavalry or something like that. Or anti-infantry cavalry. They are still classed as infantry though, by the way. Depth Guard. Now, this is a more likely to be your frontline infantry. Heavily armored, they have good leadership, decent melee attack, not as good melee defense, but quite a lot of weapon strength, especially because they have the frenzy and the regeneration. They can survive for quite prolonged amount of time. Late game, they get really good stats, even increasing their base weapon, their weapon strength actually by a lot. 20% is quite a lot, and that means just that they'll do a lot of damage in the late game, and they'll survive just a little bit more. It's kind of shame they don't have a shield. If they would have, it would be likely one of the best front lines in the game. Kind of sad they don't have a shield, really. These units would be so good with the shield. Oh, goodness. Okay. I'm getting carried away with my love for Depth Guard. So, Depth Guard with pole arms. Of course, as you can see, it's a halberd infantry. These are very good, your elite infantry units against large targets, cavalry, monsters, etc. They have quite a nice armor piercing damage with bonus versus large. They also have frenzy and the heal ability, so they also have the hunger. And this is great. It's enabled if in melee. By the way, that's what it means having the hunger. It's not regeneration. They have to be in melee for it to regenerate their troops. Overall, you can use these guys both in the mid and late game when you acquire them, and then they get just much better stats. These guys can go against the dinosaurs, the heavy monsters, pretty much on their own. A very good addition to your armies. And if you want the ultimate unit on that regard, the Bloody River Deck Guard. These are Depth Guard, ROR, and they don't just have enhanced stats all across the board. What they have as well is that ability, the frenzy, the hunger, and that enrage ability, which gives them a whopping plus 40% ward save. So these guys, they can go against any monster in the game. That's for sure. The enemy lord is on a mount, face this guy, and definitely they're going to win. Because with that damage resistance, they can survive for a lot longer, do a lot of damage, and overcome the enemy. A great addition to any of your armies. Now on to missile infantry, the bread and butter of these armies of Empire Coast. Starting with zombie pirate gunnery mobs. From now on, named gunnery mobs. Now, they don't have a lot of good melee stats. In fact, they're lower than peasants, if not mistaken, or Skaven slaves, so don't get them in melee, but they can get in the way, and they have quite a nice health pool, decent amount of units, so 120 is good for that, decent missile strength and vanguard deployment, and they also fire whilst moving. So these are kind of your skirmishing units. Don't neglect them. Just because they don't have a lot of good stats doesn't mean that these are not effective units, and especially in the early game they can surprise you even against dinosaurs or other units just because of their missile attack. Don't neglect that. They are quite good and they will surprise you as a skirmishing style of infantry, even though they don't have a lot of speed. You'll just have the numbers to deal with that. If you prefer something that causes a little bit more damage, then we have the gunnery mobs that are bombers. So they don't have a lot of ammunition, only 5, but their missile strength is quite heavy. And we're talking about a unit that will destroy blobs really well, especially in the late game where they get a lot more missile strength. So they'll cause even more damage, and they even get an additional 20% to their explosive armor piercing damage. So yep, that's good. They're gonna cause a lot of damage to blobs, so if you want that sort of style, just bring a couple of those. Now, this is a staple of any Vampire Coast army. The gunnery mobs with handguns. Appalling melee stats, but there's still 120 models with a decent health pool, so they can survive. They're always meat shielded, you know? And they'll cause their missile damage, which has a decent amount of range, even higher than handgunners, if not mistaken, and the missile strength is quite high as well. In the late game, you can field these guys for sure. 3-4 units on each army, and you'll be more than welcoming their firepower, especially that they get 160 range later on and 29 missile strength. That's a lot. So these guys will definitely be worth their money, or their Raise the Dead ability, because you can actually raise these guys, which is tremendously good. Now, if you're looking for something a little bit better, you have the Black Spot, the ROR unit. What is the advantage of this unit? In exchange, these guys are like the gunnery mobs with handguns, but they also are like the deckhands mob with pole arms, because they have armor piercing and a bonus versus large, which means that you can have these guys on the flank, and then they'll cover against light cavalry or smaller entity the monsters, basically the small monsters. They can do some damage to them, they can fire on them, and then do a little bit of damage in melee. So they will survive against the typical stuff that the AI is going to send you, or another player is going to send you, and they can be surprising. Actually, they can be quite surprising. So definitely have that unit as soon as you can. Moving on to hand cannons. The gunnery mob with hand cannons, appalling melee stats like all of these gunnery mobs, but they are anti-large. Note that they don't have an anti-large bonus, they are just classed as that. And the idea is that it's actually true. If anyone has ever gone against these guys with cavalry or anything and didn't hit them in time, they will do a tremendous amount of damage. That armor piercing damage, the number of projectiles, it's crazy. These guys, late game, I like to have like 2 on the side, 1 on each side of my armies, just so they can defend against flyers or cavalry or anything like that. Covered by some pole arms, for instance, or some death guard with pole arms. Yep. These guys will definitely be the addition that helps your flanks be secure. And if you want the unit that will actually decimate the enemy lords, single entities, or any priority targets, you have the deck gunners. Good range, 245, and they also have a nice missile strength with the shield breaker ability. So goodbye to the enemy shields. You can use these guys to just do that, weaken the enemy shielded units so that your handgunners can do their damage, or you can just use them to destroy lords, on mounts, heroes, single entities, whatever. They're very good at picking away the enemy priority targets so that your handgunners can finish them off. Overall, in the late game, you can definitely use them. It's kind of sad that they don't get more range, but they do get a lot more missile strength. So, yep, as you can see, even to the point that their missile strength equals the same amount of strength. It's like 30% more because of the black powder. So, yep. Then we have the Deck Gunners ROR, the Shade Wraith Gunners. Now, the advantage of these guys is that they have a little bit more pressure in melee, because they are ethereal. Unless the enemy has some way, magical attacks, to go overcome that physical resistance, they are not going to have a good time. And of course, they instead cause Discouraged, which is a reduction in -16 for the leadership. Now, this in conjunction with some abilities can be quite detrimental. You can use this and some discouraging abilities to suddenly lower the enemy leadership like 30 or something like that. So overall, it's a very good unit to use in a certain circumstance. Just make sure that you combo it, okay? Now on to the monsters. Felbats, not exactly a big monster. They're actually small entity sized. They used to be bigger, but I think that's the vampire count's variation. So just note that they don't have a lot of good stats, decent melee defense, but completely zero armor. They have Vanguard, and the main ability of these guys is just to get into the enemy backline, maybe harass their enemy artillery or harass the enemy ranged units. Just don't count on them staying for too long. Late game, they don't actually receive anything from redline skills. Oh. And just get some missile resistance. Oh yeah, let's move on to Bloated Corpse, one of the most interesting units in the roster. It gets the advantage of having stats that are negligible. All that this guy is all about is just jumping and suiciding on the enemy units. It doesn't have a lot of hit points or armor or anything like that. So the idea is that it will cause a lot of powerful explosion. It will decimate the enemy blobs if you can detonate it there, and it's one of the perfect units to get the stalk banner. You know, if you can get stalk on these guys, it's just so wonderful, the kind of stuff that you can pull off. Late game, all that they get is a little bit more speed, which is kind of good, and the charge bonus, I guess that helps. Then the spell resistance, I guess it's not that bad that they get some stuff, but it's always the same idea. Just ensure that you get these guys onto a blob, cover them with a stalk, for instance, and they'll be good. Scurvy dogs. Now, these are like your typical dogs. Just fast mover, they have strider, they have vanguard deployment, so you can use these guys to quickly go after the enemy artillery or ranged units while your infantry or other ranged units deal with the front line. Now, and they do that quite well. Late game, they can be used. It's like your only style of cavalry unit that you have, so you may want to field one or two of these, but you have better options. This is just in case you want to know what kind of stats you can be waiting for in the late game for these guys. But definitely a good addition for your early game to try and thwart enemy artillery or ranged units. Now to the animated hulks. Now these are monstrous infantry, but they are likely the worst monstrous infantry unit in the game. They have very poor stats, armor, melee attack, melee defense, it's very poor, decent weapon strength, which is armor piercing. So they'll do some damage, but unless you know that the enemy is going to break because of that damage, it's appalling. They'll die very easily. Be careful. This is likely. These are not like Kroxigor equivalents, or you know, they're not Minotaurs. You know, these guys are just a tier 2 monstrous infantry unit. Very well done. But unless they can break through the enemy and go after the ranged units, for instance, it's kind of difficult to use them. Even in the late game, I wouldn't use them more for that idea. Just send them in and try to get to the ranged units. A different case here for the Mournguls. Mournguls are quite an upgrade in quite a different unit. They have the Frostbite, so it reduces the enemy speed by 30%, decent weapon strength with quite a nice bonus versus infantry, but their main idea is that these guys should be used on the flank, because they have the hunger, vanguard deployment, strider, and they have stalk, so they can hide. Basically, these units are the perfect ambusher. Just put 1 or 2 units in your armies and then use them as ambushers. Go on the sides. If the enemy doesn't have any cavalry or anything properly useful on the flanks to deal with them, they'll certainly suffer. You can attack on the flank of the enemy. You have missile resistance as well. And then in the late game, these guys can almost be like a frontline monstrous infantry, or combined with your front line to deal quite a lot of damage and then push through secretly to the back line of the enemy. If you prefer something even more terrifying, the Night Terrors, the Mournguls ROR. They have the same about stats except higher weapon strength, and the biggest difference, of course, they have strider, they have stalk, they have vanguard deployment. Biggest difference is their chilling aura. So if you want to reduce the enemy speed, which, come on, it works so well with the ranged power that you have. You reduce the enemy speed, they cannot go anywhere, and suddenly you have a kill zone. Okay, that's how you should use these guys. Vanguard deploying them really ahead, prepared to heal them, and have all your ranged power attack whoever attacks them. Get it? Rotting Prometheans. They have... This is one of the best defender units in the game, if not because it's outclassed by its own roster. So their class is defended really well, armored, lots of melee defense, decent weapon strength, which is armor piercing. In the end, after all the upgrades, they become even more powerful with their resistances and with their weapon strength increases and melee attack and melee defense bonus. Yeah, you can use these guys for sure. It's only sad that they are outclassed by the other unit that you're about to see in the missile monsters. Now, Death Shriek Terrorgeist, one of the decent flyers that you get. It's an anti-large monster, flying monster. Of course, it has that armor piercing and bonus versus large idea behind it. Also the poison. It has regeneration, so it can heal itself a little bit. Note, it's not the hunger. This regeneration works all the time. And then you have Death Shriek, which is a magic missile that it can land. It's good, strong versus a single unit. So has anyone heard the word sniper? That's what these guys are. Get 3 in your armies or 2 in your armies, go after the enemy caster or priority target and let them do their job. Just make sure that you don't leave them in prolonged combat because they have quite weak leadership. That's slightly overcome with the upgrades later on. As you can see, they go up to 63 leadership, so they just get better at their work overall. Definitely a good addition to your forces. Now, to the Rotting Leviathan. If you want a monster that can hold its own at the front, you have this one. 150 armor, decent combat stats with good melee attack and melee defense, decent weapon strength, not a lot of it, but it's decent, it's good versus infantry, and they have a nice missile strength as well, so they'll keep causing damage. They are also immune to flanking, so that's the unit that you can have on the flanks of your front line, for instance, to deal with enemy single entities with some support. You know, they'll just be so difficult to remove for the enemy that you can fire on whoever is attacking them. They are immune to flanking, so you don't have to worry about that. It's great. It's great to create a kill zone, just much like those Morn Ghouls that you saw earlier. So yeah, especially in the late game, they'll get amazing stats, so definitely worth having 2 or 3. Now on to missile monsters. Deck droppers. Now these are basic missile monster unit. They fly, which is the good thing. If you're not expecting the enemy to have any flyers or any damage against flyers like good handgunners or something like that, then you can field these guys and they'll be somewhat protected while causing their damage. And here's the main idea in defense of this sort of units. If you're having a lot of mountainous terrain, for instance, you can use these guys and don't have to worry about line of sight. If you're going to fight a lot of sieges, then you can use these guys and don't have to worry about the line of sight. So that's the main advantage of them. Of course, they're not going to cause as much damage as your other gunners, but they can still do slightly good. Even in the late game, you can field a couple of these, but they're just outclassed by the next few units, such as the deck droppers with bombers. Now we're talking a lot about a different unit that can do some damage. Overall, their biggest advantage is the fact that they cause that explosive damage missiles. So they're just like the gunnery mobs with bombers. They're just the same, but on flying on a bat. And this is great against those blobs of units. If you can blob the enemy units and then send in the deck dropper bombers, a couple of these guys should shred enemy infantry really well, unless it's armored infantry, in which case, well, they won't do as much damage, still enough damage to compensate for that, I think. Now, on to the one unit that you may actually use in terms of deck droppers. The Salt Lord Scuttlers deck droppers bombers. So why are these so different? Because they actually have armor piercing. They have armor piercing damage and they have the sundered armor. So if you combine one of these with one of the others, definitely you can use that on a specific army that will use flyers. Good for sieges, good versus those armies that don't have any flyers, you know. So overall, it's a good unit to have. Just make sure that you combo it in the circumstances that you need. Now on to the deck droppers with handguns. Now this is a more serious unit. The same idea that I told you, they don't have the line of sight issues and they have a good missile strength and decent range actually. So these are the guys that you can have on your back just doing a lot of damage. They have the range for it, so they don't have to suffer against enemy ranged units as much. Just be careful. If the enemy has flyers or decent ranged units that you cannot overcome before the enemy arrives to your units, then they can die very fast. Other than that, there's some armies that you can use these guys and they won't cause you you won't feel the difference of not having the handgunners. Still, it's a circumstantial unit, that's what I will say. Unless you're fighting in mountainous terrain against those units that have no flyers or poor anti-flying skills, yeah, That's what I'm going to say about tech droppers. The handgunners just work better. That's the only problem. Now to the best unit in the roster. No kidding. Rotting Prometheus Gunnery Mob. So these are Rotting Prometheans, already a great defender, and they have Gunnery Mobs on top of them. So they have that missile strength. These guys beat Grail Knights, which is one of the best anti-large units in the game. They are large entities, and they beat Grail Knights. I just want you to think about it. They beat actually a lot of anti-large cavalry units. So these are your cavalry units. You can have them on the flanks, you can have them on the front line as well. They'll do decently against the infantry, but you can have them on the flanks, covering for your other ranged units and covering for your missile, for your infantry front line. And they still have that missile strength. So even if they're not in melee, they'll do some damage. Overall, one of the best units, especially late game. They'll become just completely impossible to breach through for the enemy without suffering a tremendous amount of damage. Just make sure that you benefit from that physical resistance, so be wary of enemies with magical attacks. And if you want the ROR version, the upgraded version, the Lamprey's Revenge. Now these units are even better in missile strength, and they have regeneration. All the single points that I told you about the Rotting Promethean Gunnery Mobs are even elevated by this unit. They get regeneration, so this is a Minotaur killer. This is actually a unit that can go against an enemy lord and do a tremendous amount of damage. So don't discount it. They are really, really good units. Get it whenever you can. Now, let's go for some artillery units. Not really artillery units, this is still a monstrous missile. It's the Necrofex Colossus. If you want a single entity that can actually move and it's an artillery unit, then go for this. Good armor, decent melee attack and melee defense stats, good weapon strength, which is armor piercing, but their benefit, of course, is that ranged power. 330 range, it's good. It outclasses some of the artillery and it can move towards it. And then you have a whopping 780 missile strength here with the black powder. It's base 600, but you can imagine how good that becomes. Now, in the late game, not a lot changes. Surprisingly, they are changing more their melee attack and melee defense and weapon strength, like the melee capabilities, which is still nice. These are good to cover for your other artillery units, for example. If you want the ultimate cover for your artillery units, you have the Gallows Giant. Why? Because it changes a little bit. Notice the range. It has flaming attacks. It causes the leadership to be lower, which kind of already is when the enemy is in between your artillery units. They can be, because of all the enemies around. It has a flamethrower, so it has reduced range, and I think this is the perfect unit to overcome the menace below. Any Skaven units try to attack your artillery, you have this guy around, and they'll likely run away after 1 or 2 shots. So it's great to have this guy actually, to cover for your artillery units. Speaking of artillery, let's go for mortars. Now, why are mortars so important in the Vampire Coast? Because of the arc of fire. You don't get a lot of units that can actually overcome line of sight issues, and sometimes you don't have a lot of units that can overcome defenses like fortifications. So having mortars is really good, especially in sieges, even in the late game. Just have a couple of these with your armies. I like to have 2 mortars, 2 carronades, and that's always a good unit to have to destroy blobs of infantry. It doesn't have armor piercing, but it does decent amount of damage even in the late game. And then we have the carronades. By the way, I'm always saying that they have better stuff, but notice that in the late game they always get ammunition and missile strength, which means that they benefit a lot from their black powder. So their first shots are just going to become much more powerful. That's why their artillery is so good. Carronades are your anti-large units. Just as the mortars are supposed to go against blobs, this is good against cavalry, single entities, monsters. Those are the targets that you should go for with the carronades. Destroy their single entities before they can reach you, or just do a lot of damage to the lord so that you can finish him off quickly. They will become much better in the late game with a lot of ammunition and missile strength, which means that they benefit from that black powder even more. If you want the ultimate artillery unit, you have Queen Bess. You can only have one, it's an ROR, and it doesn't have good stats. to defend itself, but it has that missile strength, which causes the monstrous impact. So this is the unit that people use to get thousands of kills with. It doesn't have a lot of ammunition, but it is the target to use your ammunition boosting qualities. So if you have any ability like restock, just use it on the Queen Bess. It will keep doing and churning out tremendous amounts of damage. It would have had monstrous impact. This is the same as the Dreadquake Mortar from the Chaos Dwarfs. If you have this DLC, you know what we're talking about. It's just one unit. It's kind of sad that it's an ROR. Please, CA, just turn it into a decent unit. All right. Thank you very much for watching. That is all of the units of the Vampire Coast. I hope this incentives you to play even further with this army roster, with this faction. It's one of my favorite ones, actually. Once you fight with them, you'll never forget them. See you in the future. Bye-bye.